you'll have to make a decision. If you want more in the second half of your life than what you had in the first half of your life, then you're going to have to let the first half go. Sometimes your history determines the fierceness with which you fight against what is in front of you. What I'm trying to tell you, beloved, is that you can have a new year, but it don't mean jack diddly if you don't have a new mind.
Every moment is beautiful. This is beautiful right now on your couch. Whatever it is, it's a beautiful moment. Be fully present to it. Have no guilt about it. That's the other thing, right? We're carrying old from the past, projecting in the future, or feeling guilty about now. I would say that guilt is the biggest, ugliest, most damaging sin of all. Guilt, because you carry it into the moment. You can't even enjoy this moment because you feel guilty about it. The problem is that when you're looking back, when you're constantly doing this, you're looking back, you have no energy to be available for the moment. And each moment offers its present, its gift. And if your eyes are busy distracted with what used to be or what could be, then everything that is slips by you.
Stop wasting your weapons on what people say, because it is not what they say about you that matters. It is what you say about you that threatens your destiny. You will never be defeated by what they say about you. You will be defeated by what you say about you. I cannot step into the future and still think in my past. I cannot let the rumors and the stain of what they said about me destroy my opportunity.
We have control of our minute, our hour, our day, our week, our month, and our year.
Hi, welcome to week 8 of ATTR 810. This week we're focusing on evaluation of the spine. And just like I've done with other weeks in terms of how to evaluate the spine and kind of the material that we're going to cover, I've included a couple clinical prediction rules, CPRs, for cervical spine, whether or not you need to get radiographs after a blunt injury. So I think this is really valuable in contact collision sports. Maybe where it's not an apparent C-spine injury. When do we want to send someone for radiographs if we're kind of unsure? So it's the Canadian C-spine rules. Really good article there. And then also it's the cervical radiculopathy rules. So essentially, how can we predict cervical radiculopathy issues based off, I think it's a series of 5 tests, either test or subjective questions. So those are the only 2. There are several other back, spine, clinical prediction rules. However, a lot of them deal with things that we're not going to see. So a lot of osteoporosis, kind of fractures as it relates to the elderly in the spine. So I didn't include those. So there are other ones out there. However, we're just going to use those 2 for this week. The other thing that I focused on this week, thinking about how do we evaluate the spine? What do we want to talk about? And I know last week I gave a reading regarding the McKenzie method for evaluation of SI joints. I had a couple students contact me and say that they've never heard of the McKenzie method, and maybe some clarification of what that is. So the McKenzie method is kind of a comprehensive approach to evaluation and treatment of spinal pain. So in the sacral spine, the lumbar spine, the thoracic spine, and the cervical spine. If you do know the McKenzie method, you probably only know the McKenzie method from your rehabilitation class, and you learn them probably as McKenzie extension exercises and Williams flexion exercises. And you guys have probably been doing those in some form or the other, even if you didn't know that's what they were called. You're the entire time you've done clinical practice. So if you do the cat-cow, that's a McKenzie exercise. If you do kind of like the sitting posture or the laying posture on your elbows, that's a McKenzie extension exercise. But what the McKenzie assessment method does really looks at, it's based off the theory of centralization and based off of the theory that based off of symptoms. So if you're painful in flexion, if let's say lumbar flexion, if you're painful in lumbar flexion, the treatment is lumbar extension. Vice versa, if you're painful in lumbar extension, the treatment is lumbar flexion. And there are several different ways to do this. There's several different steps to this. There's a sustained hold where you hold yourself in sitting flexion or standing flexion. Then there's repeated where you do you essentially touch your toes in a chair 10 to 15 times to see if pain develops, et cetera, et cetera. I gave you a couple articles that kind of lay that out for you. And also, I think one thing to note is that the McKenzie method of evaluation and treatment is very, very comprehensive. And it's, if you go, you can get certified. Athletic trainers are eligible to be, if they take a course, they're eligible to become certified in MDT, which is the official mechanical dysfunction therapy and treatment, I believe. So McKenzie method is available for athletic trainers to purchase and to go through in terms of continuing education. So like what I'm giving you is a snapshot. And if this seems really interesting to you, or you treat a lot of patients with low back pain, maybe you can consider going through the series of courses. I think there's 4 or 5 courses in a series. Each course is approximately $500 to $600. And it's 18 hours or 18 to 25 hours of online education followed by a 3-day in-person session. And that $500 to $600 covers all of that. It starts from the base. So you go lumbar spine, thoracic spine, cervical spine, and then there's I can't remember the last course, but there is one additional course. You can choose to get certified in it if after you've taken all the courses and you do various levels of clinical experiences, etc. Or there's also another option where you can actually get a diploma. Essentially, it's like a certificate, but it's offered by a university, not necessarily the McKenzie Institute. And that you become a McKenzie expert. So again, options that are there. The basis behind McKenzie is this idea of centralization, and then that movements in the opposite direction, particularly at the spine, can improve symptoms. And it's really based on the basic principle is that most spinal pathologies or most low back pain or spine pain is related to a problem with the disc. And then that gets back and it relates to our posture. So it really has, I think McKenzie, the McKenzie method has a great place in terms of what we deal with every day in our patients, particularly the younger patients who are always over their keyboard, slumping over, always texting. That constant flexion without subsequent extension exercises kind of shifts the thoracic, lumbar, cervical discs into a derangement, which requires kind of exercises in the opposite direction to kind of shift that back underneath the body of each vertebrae. So really interesting method. It is when you start talking about centralization and you talk about the methods, it can get a little confusing. I think the key to understand this is the test is the exercise and the exercise is the test. And this is focused on, this week is focused on evaluation, but the treatment is also the test. So for example, if you have one of the tests is doing kind of the cobra pose, where you're laying on your stomach on a treatment table with your elbows, like sitting up on your elbows. You sit like, there's one of the sustained ones, and let's say I think it's 5 minutes of sustained holding. If you start to develop low back pain in that area, the treatment for that is lumbar flexion. So sustained lumbar flexion for 5 minutes. On the other side of it, when you're doing your evaluation and you have them sustain sitting lumbar flexion, and they start to develop low back pain, the treatment is sustained, cobra exercises. In that example, you can see where the test is the exercise, but the exercise is also the test for the opposite side pathology. And the idea of centralization, I put a meta-analysis in there, and we also have a podcast. But the idea of centralization is that low back pain is more easily managed if it's actually in the low back. So if you're not having radicular pain, or you're not having radiating pain to the extremities, it's easier to manage if it's in the low back or it's in the spine, based off of empowering the patient and patient education. That's also one of the big kind of principles of McKinsey, of the McKinsey method and the McKinsey treatment method, is that it's not necessarily the clinician treating the patient. It's the clinician educating the patient so they can treat themselves and be empowered. Because low back pain may be something that they're going to experience the rest of their life, on and off. And there should be no reason they shouldn't be able to treat themselves, particularly if it's a posture issue. If you, as much as we want to focus on good posture, sometimes if after you leave, you see this in your patients all the time. If you focus on correct biomechanics or correct running form, in the clinic they run perfectly, or under your supervision they run perfectly. You let them go for the summer, they come back and they got the same shoddy biomechanics that they had earlier. So that's kind of the idea is empowering the patient. The test is the exercise is the test, and it's based off the idea of centralization and centralizing the pain in order to manage the symptoms. Also, the other thing that's really important with this is this is only due to mechanical this method only works for mechanical dysfunctions. So if you suspect there's a chemical dysfunction, so you have an issue with you've had a compression, or there's a chemical imbalance, or there's an irritant that's causing the issues, or there's an inflammatory process that's occurring on the nerves that's causing issues, it doesn't really work. It really only works for mechanical issues at the spine. I didn't want to overload you with readings or videos or anything like this. I think we only have, maybe 4 or 5 readings this week. One on the Canadian CPR, or one on the Canadian C-spine, one on the radicular, a couple on McKinsey. One of them is a case report. The case report was done by a chiropractor, and it doesn't necessarily, the actual treatment method isn't per se what we will want to use, but what I did like about that is they described every single test very clearly, and they provided pictures for all of the tests. That's why I chose that article. So relatively short readings this week, but if you are interested in more about the McKinsey method, I would encourage you to do a couple Google searches. There is all sorts of information on the McKinsey method. There are also several YouTube videos that talk about treatment. And again, this week is not talking about treatment of low back pain or treatment of spinal pain. So I wanted to stay away from those. But I think even YouTube has like 76 videos that are categorized as McKinsey evaluation method for back pain. So please be sure you take a look. The other thing I have included is the McKinsey evaluation form for the cervical spine, the thoracic spine, and the lumbar spine. Those are all in there. They're in a separate folder. You don't necessarily have to read them, but I think it would be interesting once you've practiced and learned the tests to kind of go through and use that method. It's a 3-page evaluation document that they use for, that the McKinsey Institute kind of publishes for treatment of, or for the evaluation of back pain, whether that's cervical spine, thoracic spine, or lumbar spine. And they've really done some other studies. You can take a look at them where the evaluation method is very valid and very reliable in terms of you can take 100 different clinicians and they can read the evaluation that was done by someone else and come up with the same treatment parameters. So the evaluation is very clear, very specific in terms of what they're asking. I think with the McKinsey method, it really requires practice. And so I don't recommend you watch the videos, you read the articles and you just do it on a patient. I think you really need to practice these on classmates. You really need to practice these on other clinicians you work with. You really need to practice these on healthy individuals for you to truly understand. Because if you just read this and you try to go implement it, it's not going to make a difference. And it's really, really important that you practice this if you want to implement it. And I think it's a very valuable tool. I think now it's kind of shifted from the 1980s when this was originally published about to today. It's shifted more as particularly in athletic training, it shifted to a portion of the treatment that we do for low back pain and thoracic pain and cervical pain, but it hasn't become the only treatment that we use at a time. The MDT kind of certified individuals, they believe in this, that this should be the only thing that you use, that you shouldn't use adjunct therapies or adjunct modalities, etc. That you should only be using the McKinsey extension Williams flexion exercises to treat these derangements and these issues. I don't necessarily think that is true, but it does add another layer to your evaluation that I have found very, very, very valuable. I didn't necessarily learn about this until last semester of my master's degree, and I didn't learn it in class. It was something that I picked up because one of my patients was going to physical therapy with low back pain, and I picked it up from talking to the physical therapist who had taken some of these courses in MDT. So, take it for what it's worth, but I really do think it adds value, particularly the evaluation methods and treatment methods. It adds value to your clinical practice, but the key is, just like anything else, you have to practice them and you have to start to develop a plan on how you want to implement them. And that kind of takes me back to a lot of the other things we've talked about in this class is all of this information, all of these CPRs, all of these prevention strategies, all of these screening strategies are only as valuable as you make them. You could go through this class, learn about all of these things, decide not to practice them, decide not to implement them, decide it was too hard, decide there were too many barriers, and you've gained nothing from the class. So part of clinical skill development is simply implementing them and practicing them until they become part of clinical practice. It's, like I said, it's no different than when you originally learned how to do an ankle evaluation or when you originally learned how to do a knee evaluation. If you never do one, if you say, well, I don't have time to learn that, I don't have time to implement that, then how are you ever going to evaluate a knee or an ankle? You had to, in undergraduate or in professional programs, that practice time was built in through laboratories, and that practice time was built in through your clinical experiences. In a post-professional program, particularly a doctoral program, it's kind of expected that you build that time in, and what makes it difficult, I think, is that we're doing things that you're doing things in your clinic and in your patient care that your colleagues probably aren't doing. So think about when you learned how to evaluate an ankle. You probably learned how to evaluate your preceptor or your clinical instructor probably was evaluating the ankle very, very similar to you. Depending on when you came online, maybe you started to do the Kliger's test and other people didn't do the Kliger's test, or your preceptor didn't do the Kliger's test. But now it's ubiquitous and everyone does that. But But for you all in your situation, you have to carve out that time to really make this work, to really move forward your clinical practice. And yes, it's going to seem, people are going to look at you. People are going to say, why are you doing that? You need to be able to answer them, because being able to answer the question of why is really important. And doing new things takes practice. Doing new things, particularly that other people around you aren't doing, is sometimes challenging. But if you want to grow as a clinician, you have to be able to get out of your comfort zone and practice those things. And having those conversations, well, where we talk about, well, is this really the best method, et cetera, with your colleagues who may not use any of these tools that we've learned in the course thus far. So, yeah, I know it seems like I go on this kind of tangent every week, but I really do think it's important, because some of the things that we are doing in this class are really innovative and are really pushing athletic training forward. But it only will get pushed forward as much as you all implement it, and it will only be as valuable as you make it. So I think that's a really key point. Don't forget that this week we have a synchronous session from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday. We are going to focus on diagnostic algorithms. So one of your long-term assignments, or kind of 2 your long-term assignments, one of them is a diagnostic algorithm. The other one is essentially a treatment algorithm to go along with that diagnostic algorithm. And we're going to really spend some time going over diagnostic algorithms, what they are. I know you've seen them probably I know you've seen them in the ankle evaluation, readings. So you can go back and look those if you don't remember reading that one. I know you've worked on something similar to in the algorithms with Dr. E in previous semesters, but we're really gonna kind of hone in and work on these clinical decision-making trees, and that's what we'll spend the hour doing. For your weekly assignment, your weekly task, pretty straightforward. I don't anticipate that taking more than an hour. So yeah, I think that's where we're at this week. So if you do have any questions, please let me know. If I don't see you on Wednesday, have a great week. If I do, please bring any questions you have, and I'll be happy to answer them after our lecture. Have a great week.